It's really great to be here. I love getting these opportunities to speak with you and to study. Any of us who have ever been teachers know that you never know something so well as when you have to study it to talk about it later. And so I've really enjoyed getting to dive into the Word these last couple of weeks as we prepare for this lesson. This is actually the first part of a two-part series that Rob is going to conclude next week when he is back on redefining wealth and redefining giving. And so all good preachers ask somebody else to preach on giving while they're gone. This is exactly what preachers are supposed to do. It avoids conflicts of interest. And so I get to be in front of you because I get absolutely nothing from this. I actually get paid double what I'm normally paid. So we're going to be speaking about the story of the widow's coins, a story that many of us probably already know, but I'd like to recast it a little bit. And before we actually get to the story of the widow's coins, I would like to suggest a couple of things about Jesus' ministry, especially as it is presented in the Gospel of Luke. I believe that we can often, as Christians, make two mistakes on extremes, and I'd like to describe those extremes for you. The first extreme is the kind of extreme where, honestly, I grew up in. It's the extreme in which the gospel has no word, nothing to say about our life on earth. Every single message that you ever read anywhere in the New Testament is a spiritual message. It is not about what happens on this earth. And that is an extreme that I no longer hold to, but it's how I was brought up. Some of you might be from a faith tradition like that as well, where everything that you read about in the New Testament is about spiritualness. It's everything is happening in the spiritual realm. There's nothing to be done about life here on earth. The other extreme is another brand of Christianity, again, that some of you might be personally familiar with, I don't know, but it's the one that says everything about the gospel is about the here and now. And what Jesus came to do is to give you money and wealth and riches now. And that's really what the main point of the gospel is. And as with so many things, the truth is actually somewhere right in the middle of those extremes. Brandon read from Luke chapter 4 this morning these words that Jesus, in the Gospel of Luke, begin his ministry. He has done all that we know about in the Gospel of Luke. If you read the Gospel of Luke on its own, all that we know about that Jesus has done so far is he's been led by the Spirit into the wilderness. He's been tempted. And when he returns, he begins a healing ministry in and around the Sea of Galilee, around Capernaum and some towns there. And then he returns to his hometown of Nazareth. And here is a local boy who's returned, and maybe that it was common for them to say, you know what, we're going to let you be the guest speaker today. And so they hand him the scroll of the prophet Isaiah, and he proceeds to read those verses that Brandon read for us this morning, in which Jesus said, "The Spirit of the Lord has anointed me," that is, he has made me his Messiah. These are the words of Isaiah in Isaiah both 61 and 58. He kind of combines them together to make the reading that he does. And he says, the Spirit of the Lord has come on me to bring good news to the poor, release to the captives, recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, and to proclaim a year of jubilee, a year of freedom and release from everything that has been holding you down. And the question is, what is that good news to the poor that Jesus came to preach? There is a sense in which, believe me, I absolutely believe that there's a sense in which the gospel, the good news to the poor that Jesus preached, was himself. That's the good news. Jesus is the good news to the poor and everybody else. But if you read the rest of the Gospel of Luke, you realize that in the Gospel of Luke, Luke is making sure that we know over and over and over that Jesus didn't just come to bring himself, he also came to bring justice. That the gospel is justice in this world. It is both. It is both himself, that is, justice in the future, and it is also now, justice in the world. It is both. Jesus came to change the way that his followers, his disciples, worked in the world. He wanted to change the choices that they would make. He wanted to make sure that they would make choices that would align with the kind of kingdom that Jesus wanted to establish. And so, if you were to read the entire Gospel of Luke, you would read tons of stories, and it would come alive. Things like when Jesus said in Luke chapter 12, "Sell your possessions and give to the poor." And when he tells the story of the Good Samaritan, the one guy who would decide to spend his own wealth to help somebody in need, where he recast the hero of the story as Israel's enemy. And you would read in Luke 16, the story of the rich man and Lazarus, in which things get turned on their heads. In that story, the rich man and Lazarus don't receive any differences now. They have to wait till after they die. But their stories end up on opposite ends of each other. More about that later. And you'd read the story of Zacchaeus and the rich young ruler who had opposite reactions to Jesus' command to give away what you have and give to the poor. One of the elements of the gospel that Jesus came to bring is justice in the world now, because that's the kind of kingdom he has established, a kingdom in which justice reigns. Now, in the story that we're going to be reading, when we get to Luke 20 and 21, I don't want you to misunderstand what I'm trying to say, because I really promise I'm not going on a political rant. I promise I'm not, okay? I'm trying to stay away from that. So I want to give my final caveat before we actually dig into the story, okay? I am not saying that Jesus has word one to say about any kind of macroeconomic system. Jesus is not praising capitalism versus socialism versus communism versus anarcho-syndicalist communes. None of that stuff is being approved or disapproved by Jesus. What Jesus is concerned about is his people. What choices are the people who are part of Jesus' kingdom making? Because it doesn't matter what the larger economic system is in the nation or the culture in which you live. That doesn't matter. We, as God's people, can make specific choices that align with the purposes of Jesus' kingdom and God's justice. And so when I say what I'm going to say next, when the next slide pops up, I don't want you to be thinking in terms of macroeconomic system. I want you to be thinking about God's justice done by his people. And so I'm just going to go ahead now and spoil the ending for you. This is the main point of my lesson today. You ready? Jesus condemns predatory economics. That is, Jesus condemns any system, or at least his people's participation in a system in which the vulnerable, the poor, are forced to give everything that they have while the rich are allowed to hoard a surplus. Now that sounds very political nowadays, but that's only coincidental. That's not really political, that's just Jesus. Jesus does not like it whenever Christians are participating wholeheartedly in a system that allows the rich to hoard a surplus while the poor are exploited. That is predatory economics. And it can happen whether we're in a capitalist system or a socialist system or a communist system or whatever system. Jesus says that's not what my people ought to be about. That's the main point. So at this point, if you get sleepy and nod off, you still have everything you need. Okay? Just want you to understand. We're almost ready to get to Luke 20. It's weird. The introduction is at least as long as the sermon itself. I apologize for that. That's just the way it sort of ended up. Sorry about that. Luke chapter 20. Here's what's happened so far. Jesus has already entered the city of Jerusalem for the last time. It's already been Palm Sunday. He has entered Jerusalem, and then he now spends several days going into the city. He teaches in the temple, and then at night he goes back out and stays in Bethany at the home of Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. And then every day, the next day, he comes back inside. And he does that on Sunday and on Monday and on Tuesday and on Wednesday of his final week near Jerusalem. I'm not sure exactly what day what we're about to read happened. My guess is Wednesday, because so much stuff has happened while he's been in there. And so this appears to be the very end. He is not the only person in Jerusalem. This is a huge moment in Jerusalem, like it is every year, because it's the time of the Passover. And the Passover is going to be the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread that's going to last a week. And because it's the holiest week in the Jewish calendar, then lots of people have traveled to Jerusalem just for this moment. And so it is chock full of visitors from all over the place. And of course, if they're Jews, they are all going to be going to the temple, because the temple is the center of where they're going to do their worship. And so Jesus takes this opportunity to preach about what's going on in the temple. You see, the temple is a symbol of a lot of things that Jesus believes is wrong with the worship of the people of his day. The temple is run by the Sadducees. I'm sure that we have all studied and we know all of the different groups that are in there, but let's just, review. The temple is run by the Sadducees. The Sadducees were a political party that had very early, like 90 years before these events, had made peace with the Romans. They had basically invited the Romans in and said, Romans, we would like for you to come in and help us. You see, there was a Jewish civil war going on. There were like two sons of some Maccabean king or something or other that were fighting over who was going to get to be the next king and high priest, and they were fighting, and one of them was getting the help of some Parthians out to the east, and another one said, hey, why don't we invite the Romans to come in and help us? And so the Sadducees had invited the Romans in, help us kick out the Parthians and help us win our little civil war. And the Romans were like, great, but now we run things. And the Sadducees were like, great, as long as we get to run the temple. And the Romans were like, great, and everything. And so that's how that all happened. So the Sadducees get to run everything. So the high priest is always a Sadducee, and the Sadducees get to run the temple and how things go on inside the temple. In addition, there's also Pharisees in town, of course, and the Pharisees are much more widespread throughout the rest of Israel, and these are pious people. They believe that the way to keep God from sending them into exile again is to keep the law, and so they have become massive legalists and have completely lost the heart of God. Then there are other teachers of the law, and teachers of the law or scribes, depending on how your translation is going to read later, might be of any of the parties or even none of them, but they are academics. They're the people who make a living out of studying the minutia of the Hebrew Scriptures and being experts. And so they might be Sadducees, they might be Pharisees, they might be from the school of Shammai or the school of Hillel, or they might be from all over the place. Who knows? They just love being academics, and so they are the academics. If they had universities, these would be the guys who wrote books and did research and had PhDs after their names. That's who they are. And all of them don't like Jesus. None of them like Jesus. Because Jesus has come in and every day he's preaching. He's preaching against the temple and he's preaching against tradition and he's teaching against all of the different things that they rely on to maintain control and status and power. And so for days, they come and they try to beat up on Jesus with odd questions and hard questions and hoping that Jesus can't answer them. And Jesus not only answers them, but gets increasingly savage as the week goes on. He is just getting mean, and they deserve it. So I don't want you to feel bad for him at all. But we're going to read in a second just how savage Jesus got. He was not playing. And so he is very upset with the temple and with the religious leaders of the day. The temple had ceased to be a sacred place and instead had become a bank and a public market like an agora or a forum, and it's become a courthouse and a debate center, and it's the focus of all of the hypocrisy that Jesus hates. And it's that hypocrisy that Jesus understands is going to cause them to ultimately reject him in just a couple of days, in the ultimate sense. It is the fact that they don't know God and instead love their status quo. So he's going to, in fact, right after the events that we're going to talk about this morning, this isn't part of the lesson, but he's then going to go and he's going to actually predict the destruction of the temple itself as punishment for rejecting him. That's going to be later in chapter 21, and we don't have time for that this morning. Because I haven't even begun the sermon yet. We're now ready. Luke chapter 20. So, starting in verse 45. So, Jesus is walking around the temple as he's been doing for the last 3 days. He's talking to his disciples, but there are crowds surrounding, wanting to hear what this rabbi is saying to his disciples as he teaches them. And so, while all the people were listening, Jesus said to his disciples, "Beware of the teachers of the law, the scribes. Beware of these guys." And you have to remember, the temple is where everybody was. I am 100% certain that as Jesus says, "Beware of the scribes," he is at that moment pointing at scribes who are right there. They hear it too. He's saying this right out as loud as possible, right in front of the very people he's talking about. He sees them walking by and he says, "Beware of those guys. Beware of the teachers of the law." And here's the reason why. There are at least 4 different reasons that he gives of why he wants his disciples to beware of those guys. Number 1, they like to walk around in flowing robes. That seems odd to us. Clothing produce status. The longer and more elaborate your robes, the richer and more important you were. Fortunately, in 2021, nobody cares anything at all about clothing. It no longer confers status. We've solved that problem. Let's move on. I'm just kidding. I actually did that deliberately this morning. I decided that this morning for this sermon, I was going to use the Jordan Smyers Pastor Startup Kit, and I wore the dark jeans, the brown shoes, the collared shirt untucked. I nailed it. Oh, wait, hang on. Just to complete the hip pastor look, I brought along my glasses. Unfortunately, while I can see my paper much better, I cannot see anything out there, so those are coming off. The second thing, besides their long robes, was that they loved to be greeted in public areas. They love the status that is gained by going to different public areas. For example, the marketplaces. As they walk around the marketplaces, everybody's, "Oh, teacher, you are so great." They love to hear their titles shouted out. They love to have the most important seats in the synagogues. Because where you sat in the synagogue conferred status. That was still going on, by the way, in the early church. James talks about that in James chapter 2, about churches doing exactly the same thing in their churches that was happening in synagogues. There were places of honor, and where you sat told people what status you had. And they love to have the places of honor at banquets. Jesus has done a lot of teaching on this as well. Go back to Luke chapter 14 for a very long discourse about choosing which seats you're going to have at different banquets. That is, they love to be respected in the marketplaces, the synagogues, and at banquets. That is, at centers of economic power, centers of religious power, centers of social power. They wanted to be respected and have status in all of those places. This was what they were most concerned about, was status. So they love the long robes that indicate how rich and powerful they are. They love to have status in every possible arena. And then we come to the third one, and this one is the hard one. He says, they devour widows' houses. If you have a study Bible that has little notes down at the bottom, then there might be something that tries to explain what that phrase means. They devour widows' houses. And my guess is that every study Bible made by a different company says something different. Everybody has a different idea. Jesus doesn't explain it. It's obviously something that his disciples completely understand, but he doesn't explain it for us. I'll tell you the one that I thought, as I was reading through different commentaries and everything, trying to understand what it meant that they devour widows' houses, the one that made the most sense to me, the one that spoke to me the most, was the idea that these academics would go to widows and say, guess what? I am available for you to host us at your home. And they couldn't very well say no. This was somebody of status telling them that they were coming. It was something that everybody wanted. But widows were the people that were least able to handle making a big feast or banquet for other people. And so in order to receive the honor of eating with this widow and them throwing a banquet in their honor, they were using up supplies and resources that the widows could ill afford to spend because they had no way of replacing those resources. They were widows. And so their husbands were dead, and in that society, that probably meant that their source of income was dried up. And so that's what makes the most sense to me. There could also be something about rent and exploiting them in terms of charging them exorbitant rents or loans or interest. I don't know exactly. There's lots of different ideas out there. In some way, Jesus accused these scribes, these teachers of the law, of exploiting widows, a group that was the most economically vulnerable at that time. And they exploited them. I don't know what that looks like nowadays. We are fortunate, most of us, to be clearly in the upper 10% economically of everybody that has ever lived on the earth. My friend Daniel from the Italian service plays guitar up here. He was telling me there's a website called howrichami.com, and you put in your income, and it tells you where you fall in the world. And I was like, I'm staying away from that website. That sounds like that'd be too convicting for me. I don't want anything to do with that. But I'm guessing that I'm in the top, 93%. I'm guessing. I don't know. I'm wondering. But I wonder if there are things in our society that exploit the poor. There is one thing I will say that I feel like is pure exploitation of the poor, and that is our gambling systems in America. Lotteries, state lotteries, casinos, things like that. When you look at the demographics of the people that participate in things like that, they're overwhelmingly poor who participate in lotteries. And that is money that the state gets in, billions upon billions of dollars that the state receives in terms of money. But those are billions and billions of extra dollars they are getting from the poorest people in the society. They pay out a pittance of what they bring in and keep the rest. It feels to me like lotteries and state-run casinos or state-approved tax casinos are really just big taxes on the poor. That's what it feels like to me. I apologize that that's too political. That I may have gone and done exactly what I said I wasn't going to do. I'm sorry. And then the fourth thing that Jesus says that they like to do is to make lengthy prayers just for a show. They are interested in appearances and not about actual relationship with the God to whom they are praying. So these teachers were claiming authority and status and honor, and therefore they were trying to deny it to Jesus as they challenged him. He was the one who truly deserved it. And Jesus condemns them to punishment. He says these men will be punished most severely. And now because there should never in a million years have been a chapter division right here. Chapter divisions came like 200 years ago. Please don't think I'm saying anything about inspiration of Scripture when I say that. There should not have been a chapter division right here, because Jesus then, I believe, turns while he is teaching and he sees a perfect example of what he's talking about. And this is where Luke 21 begins. As Jesus looked up, he sees this scene. You see, there's boxes and containers everywhere where people can put money into the temple. Now, I'll be honest, I don't know exactly how this worked, and I don't know that anybody does. We do have a reference to a temple tax elsewhere in the Gospels. Maybe that's what this is talking about. But there's nothing that says that that's what's going on here. This could have been admission fee, where in order to come into the temple, you had to drop money in just for the privilege of coming into the temple. An admission fee charged by the Sadducees. It could have been that, I don't know. But for whatever reason, they are putting in gifts, as it says in verse 1. He saw the rich putting their gifts into the temple treasury. Depending on how your verse 4 reads, I don't really know. But later on in verse 4, it says that Jesus said that the rich people had given gifts out of their wealth. At least in my translation. You might have a translation that says out of their surplus. The idea being that as the rich are putting their gifts into the temple treasury, what they are giving away is something that they will never miss. There is zero sacrifice involved in what these rich people are putting in. But then in verse 2, he also saw a poor widow put in 2 very small copper coins. In the Old King James, I think they were referred to as mites, which I only know as bugs that make me itch. I don't know really what a mite is, but it's something super, super small, okay? It's something worthless. The 1 euro cent coin. You know how, this is odd. People, I'm sorry. I don't hide your ears, people. I don't want you to hear me say anything bad about where we're living. It's odd for Americans when we come over here and we realize that their money is different sizes. You know, the bills are different sizes. You know, 5s are smaller than a 10. 10s are smaller than a 20. 20s are smaller than a 50. And all of our dollars are exactly the same size, right? Think about how small the 1 euro penny is. It's so small, I wonder how it can even be used for money. Like, I don't even know how you would notice that it's in your pocket. It's so small. It's like half the size of a regular penny. And a regular penny, like an American penny, is completely worthless. There's not a person in here that would walk down the street, see a penny on the ground and think, it's worth it, just the creaking in my bones to reach over and pick it up. It's not. Now, I may have just dated myself. My bones creak when I've been down to pick up pennies. Do y'all's? It's possible that they don't. Jordan?
I'm there, man.
Okay. Whatever these coins were, they were a tiny, tiny amount. Most modern English translations don't bother translating the actual words that are used there because there's no real understanding of how tiny this amount is. It's a tiny fraction of a single day's pay that is so worthless as to be hardly worth mentioning. And she puts those 2 small copper coins into the temple treasury. And Jesus says, truly I tell you, this poor widow has put in more than all the others. All these people gave their gifts out of their wealth, but she, out of her poverty, put in all she had to live on. If you actually read the Greek, and I don't, but Rob told me this, at the end of verse 4, the Greek there actually reads that out of her poverty, she put in her whole life. Now, I think that probably this is how we ought to think about it, put in all she had to live on. But there is a sense in which when she has put in those 2 coins, remember, she is a poor widow. She has no way of earning money. There are no more resources coming in. It's almost as if when she puts those coins in, she's saying, I'm done. This is the end. This is all I've got left. I wouldn't have been able to use these coins to even buy daily bread with. And she drops them in. That's the end. It's the end of her life. It's the end of everything. She has now given up. There's nothing left for her. And Jesus hates this. He hates this. The scribes, the teachers of the law, he said, beware of them, because they're the kind of people that are exploiting women just like this one. And by her having to do this, that tells you it's not just the teachers of the law that are doing this. This entire system of the temple, as we know it, is exploiting this widow to bleed her dry of the last 2 small coins that she has. And you can just tell the indignation in Jesus' voice. This is the kind of thing that I hate. This is not the justice that I want to see in the world. If leaders ever act like their own status and money is more important than the well-being of women like these widows, of the most vulnerable among us, of the most exploitable among us, of the poorest among us, then they should not be followed. These scribes, these Sadducees should not be followed because they were exploiting women just like this. And if we are ever, by the way, if we are ever, as our lives go on, if we are ever part of a church that cares way more about its spotlights and money than it does about helping the people like this in the community, let's run far away. Let's not be part of those kind of communities of faith. Let's instead be the kind of people like Jesus wants in his kingdom that are looking for opportunities to help this woman, not exploit her. And so let's finish by thinking about the gospel as we see them in this story about the widow. First of all, we've already mentioned the gospel inverts everything from the way this world actually works. Think about the people that run the big corporations and run the committees in government and run everything that is anyone that ever makes decisions that affect the rest of us. Who are those people? The people with the money. People that sit on boards of corporations are people that themselves have tons and tons of money. They are the people that get to make all the decisions. And if we're not careful, we can sometimes think that when we see somebody who is super rich and super successful by the standards of the world, that those must be the people that we need running our churches. That's what we need to be looking for in elders and deacons and people running things, the people that have all the money because they've shown themselves to be highly successful. And I would say that the exact opposite is true. I'll tell you who I would like to look for to find people that are the leaders in the churches that I'm a member of. I want to find people who have decided to give everything up for Jesus. They could be making a ton of money somewhere. They've got talent. They've got credentials. They could be doing a lot, but they've decided they're just going to give their whole life over to Jesus. And that's the kind of person that I look for in a leader in the churches in which I'm a member. I want to find people who have decided that they're going to give what they have, not try to take what other people have. It's just another case of the way in which the gospel inverts the way our world is supposed to work. Secondly, we see that Jesus is always caring for those who need it, even the people that the rest of the society has written off. And again, I cannot wait. And Rob told me that maybe next week he's going to preach on Zacchaeus, and I hope so because that's my favorite story in all of the Bible. And so I'm hoping that we get to hear a lesson next week on Zacchaeus. And the reason is because Zacchaeus represents the kind of person that most of society, even God-fearing people in society, would say could never be reached by the gospel. And Jesus says, no, I'm always looking for the people that actually need it, and sometimes those are the people that need it the most. Jesus said the Son of Man came to seek and save the lost. And you know who he said that to? Zacchaeus. And we make a mistake when we limit the word lost to only mean lost spiritually. There are people who need us to intervene in their lives right now. People who are down to their last 2 small coins. And we are needed to try to help those people too. People who have poverty or sickness or any other of those things that are listed in Luke chapter 4 that Jesus said were the crux of his kingdom message. Are they sick? Are they oppressed? Are they poor? Are they captive in some way? Little thing about the Gospel of Luke. You know when Jesus goes around healing people in the Gospel of Luke, Luke doesn't use the word for heal. Remember, Luke is a doctor. And so if anyone's going to talk about healing, it's going to be Luke. But you know what word Luke uses more often when he talks about Jesus healing people? He doesn't say that Jesus healed them. He says that Jesus released them. Isn't that beautiful? He released them from what was oppressing them. And that's the message that Jesus brought and that he wants his people to take out into the world. He wants us to help him redeem the broken parts of this world. And then finally, Jesus redefined wealth as sacrificial giving. This widow was willing to give all that she had just so she could enter the house of God to worship him. I wonder how many of us are willing to sacrifice everything just for a chance to worship God. Just for a chance. In just a few days, maybe 2 days, Jesus is going to give all that he has. He's going to go to the cross and he's going to give up his dignity. And he's going to give up his reputation, and he's going to give up his very life. He's going to pray for forgiveness for the very soldiers who are in the middle of nailing his feet and hands to a cross. He's going to wash the feet of the very friend who will betray him to those leaders. So, of course, he's going to approve of this widow who was willing to give everything that she has. Listen, it's not fun to be the widow. I'm not saying that, be the widow, it's fun, yay. Giving up everything. Experiencing sacrifice and being willing to give, even to the point that we are sacrificing what we have. We're sacrificing our plans. We're sacrificing all of our good things so that we can experience greater things. If we don't experience sacrificing, though, we never get to experience that greater good that Jesus promises, the promise of himself. Ultimately, we are looking for that greatest good. We are looking for that true good news, that gospel that Jesus promised, because he gave himself on a cross.